One of the things that you and I have been experiencing a lot recently in our investigations has been a coalescing of information that we found historically, oftentimes a long time ago. We're finding this information coming together to form a larger picture, sometimes information that we almost kind of forgot about. That's one of the reasons why I like to use timelines so much, because I like to slot information in and I suddenly see things present themselves in a new light. And that's what's been happening here with, kind of a long going investigation that you and I have done, looking into sort of when COVID started. And this all started with finding a State Department email that came out in April 2020. And it's actually not an email. What it really is it's a memo. It's a formal analysis, their assessment of where the State Department thought COVID came from. And in this memo, they say that it's overwhelmingly likely that COVID came from a lab. Now, put yourselves back in April of 2020 when all of the hysteria was coming to the fore and the nation was closing down, and the State Department internally had determined that COVID had come from a lab, the debate that was going to follow that. That obviously was not made public. We got it through a release from U.S. Right to Know sometime in, I think it was late 22. But we're really surprised at that email because they were very emphatic. They were mostly going off of circumstantial evidence, but it was clearly an intelligence analysis. And once again, they looked at 5 different possibilities for COVID, including a natural origin, and they effectively mocked the other 4 and said, there's just essentially no chance that these were the cause. So with, that, just think about that as a backdrop to everything that was going on that we were seeing publicly at the time. So that kind of set us off. And what got us very curious is how sharply this State Department take on things, which was only released later, how sharply that differed with I don't know if it was an informal assessment technically, but the intelligence community issued a very early assessment on COVID, and they issued it on April 30th. I think it actually hit the public's eyes the next day on May 1st, but regardless, the intelligence community stepped into the fray publicly, bearing in mind nobody's seen the State Department memo. And they said that they concurred with the wide scientific consensus that COVID was neither genetically modified or man-made. Now, they held open the possibility of a lab leak. They said that as they'll continue to look at information, and as further information comes forward, they'll decide whether or not it was, had a natural origin or if it had leaked from a lab. But they were very careful in their wording because they knew what everybody was going to focus on. COVID was not genetically modified. COVID was not man-made. And sure enough, that's what everybody focused on. And so, if you juxtapose these two things, the IC assessment, which as it came out, effectively served to become kind of the groundwork for the entire natural origin narrative that we were then subjected to for the next, year and a half. I mean, the debate's still out there today, although you and I both feel it's effectively dead, and it absolutely came out of a lab. But that really was what was used. And it's funny that the IC assessment uses the words wide scientific consensus, because there's a problem with that. At the time that assessment came out, there was no widespread scientific consensus. They just pretended that there was. The only consensus that they had to go with was the fiction that Fauci was pushing. So this is, it's this area that we started to look at and really focus in on these 4 months. Why don't you jump in here?
Yeah, I remember when that came out, the IC statement, and I shook my head. I knew it was crap, but I wasn't surprised because that's exactly what I was expecting from the same IC that set up Trump and Russiagate and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, sure, obviously they're going to say that. But you're absolutely right. The way it was written to dismiss any whatever small possibility of engineered or manipulated virus. That was off the table. And
bearing in mind that they didn't have the data to make that statement.
Of course not. But that's what, and that's in the top part. And at the bottom part, as you say, they add, well, keep an open mind. that's only added as a sort of an afterthought. And we all knew the media wouldn't focus on that anyway. Plus, even if we analyze the bottom part.
But I would just note, I don't think it was an afterthought. It was written to come across as an afterthought. But what it was doing was allowing the intelligence community to point to that and say, wait, no, you can't hold us accountable for that. We said we still might look at as, that a lab leak was possible. That's why it was written that way.
I agree. But there was also, if you read it carefully, especially in tandem with the previous paragraph, it was meant, the only little door they kept open is for if a natural virus was brought into the lab and then leaked out of the lab. That's sort of the only little door they kept open. Any kind of manipulation was off the table. And by the way, Fauci went on National Geographic 2 days later and said exactly the same thing. It's natural, 100% everything, could it have come out of a lab? Well, I mean, natural viruses could leak out of a lab. So that was the agreed narrative. Obviously, the agreed narrative is just nature, seafood market, whatever. But if for whatever reason something comes out and they can't, push back against it, they still have that little door for themselves. And it's an important door because by saying that it was manipulated, well, this kind of accidents happen. Oops, sorry, but it would have come out of nature anyway because it's a natural virus. So what they really wanted to get away from is playing around with these viruses, gain of function, the thing that Fauci did, the thing that Fauci changed. Of course, we talked about this on previous shows that there was a moratorium. You can't do these experiments. By the way, they serve no purpose. It's just pure vanity. And then Fauci in 2017, during the transition to Trump, quietly changed the rules while no one was looking and then made it possible again. And so it comes back to him and, he's the one being protected here. But you're absolutely right. The role of the intelligence community in this narrative has not been highlighted enough. There hasn't been enough focus on it at all. I mean, there's been a lot of focus on the cover-up instigated by Daszak, EcoHealth. There's been a lot of focus on the cover-up instigated by Fauci. But there was this big umbrella over them. And of course, that was the intelligence community. As you were saying, that started way earlier than April of 2020.
Yeah. And from the moment that we found this State Department email, it's always bothered the heck out of the both of us. And as it turns out, there's a reason for the timing of these sudden intelligence. At the time when this IC assessment came out, everybody was sort of scratching their heads like, gosh, that's kind of weird. The people who are researching this. And what happened was the State Department email actually got reported on by one person, a guy named Bill Gertz and it was, I always want to say Washington, it was the Washington Times. And he got a hold of a copy of this memo and he reported on it and he quoted from it. And it turns out with hindsight, 100% accurate. He clearly saw the document. And it's also worth noting that everything that they factually laid out in this document that's now public is 100% correct. So the information they had at the time was accurate upon which they based their assessment. If you read the document in real time in today's, now with all the knowledge that we have out there, everything they're saying is 100% correct and has been proven true with time. And so suddenly we get this reporting of it on April 28th. And what happens? The IC steps in immediately to squelch that with their assessment. And that assessment absolutely overwhelmed the reporting. You never heard about the State Department memo again. And now, as we know, the State Department memo has proven 100% accurate. And this is what really piqued my curiosity. I've been doing a lot of work on this on Twitter and have been kind of carefully uploading a certain amount of information regarding it each day, kind of incrementally trying to add the layers. And I've been doing that very much by intent. But the thrust of it, as we started investigating this for both of us, is that if the State Department had all of this information at that point in time, stepping back into they wrote it, we believe it was early April, might have even been written in March, but probably sometime in April 2020. If they had all this information at their disposal, so did the intelligence community. It is impossible that that the State Department could have access to this information and the intelligence community couldn't, and which makes the IC's assessment all that much more suspect. Overlay that with the timing of trying to squelch the reporting on the State Department memo, and you can kind of see where we're headed on this.
Well, and that's right. And they probably got a lot of these points from elements of the intelligence community and things that they didn't. For instance, from their consul general in Wuhan, that's a State Department employee. He was talking about this back in October of 2019. So that's a data point. They had a lot of data points. There's no question whatsoever that they would have shared those. It was like, look what we got here. And then the guy in the Washington Times got a hold of it, and that's when the intelligence community, who'd just been probably just treating the State Department or the people over there who were looking at this as like a pesky fly, and suddenly they knew April 28th, we got to act on this because now it's out in the papers that there is this memo, and boom, there came their own statement, which kind of shut off all these debates. And one thing to recall as well is not just that memo. You already mentioned that there was never any consensus. The only consensus there was among Fauci paid scientists. That's it. When those Fauci paid scientists put out their fraudulent proximal origin paper, first they put it out online before it was published in Nature on March 17th of 2020. When they put it out online, a person we know, Rosanna Segreto, commented on it. She's a biologist. She commented on it. Said, no, have you looked at this? And you just completely picked it apart in real time. We're talking February of 2020. So you can't pretend that there weren't scientists out there who were clearly showing that this isn't working. This doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, another guy we know, Yuri Dagan, came in April of 2020 after the fraudulent paper was published in Nature, and he wrote an entire paper and published it online, completely tearing this thing apart forensically, absolutely tearing it apart. And it was actually the Pentagon who then used Yuri's inputs to, I'm sure without telling him, they just got it offline. They probably thought, oh, wow, brilliant guy. He did it, did all the work for us. They wrote their own paper, totally dismantling the natural origin narrative. So you had scientists dismantling this thing, and then you had the Pentagon, and then you had the State Department. You got all these elements. And of course, you got President Trump. We haven't even talked about him yet. He was saying it in public. And to push back against all that, they put out that fraudulent April 30th statement.
Yeah. Now, before we go further and get into the specific segments of the dates, I think it's worth laying the groundwork with a conversation that was had on Twitter back at the end of December. And it was a friend of ours, Techno, sent out, there's an email that was out of the DNI's office about the creation of this assessment. And there's a name that's redacted. Somebody had requested that the assessment be done. And that's what we can't tell. So Techno asked Richard Grinnell, who was the then acting director of national intelligence. And it was his office that issued the IC statement. So the IC, as all the various 17 agencies, they put their things together and it goes into the DNI's office. Everything gets distilled, filtered down to a short statement, and it gets issued out of that office. And Techno went and asked the question of who it was that had requested that this be done. And although we got a pretty strong response from Grinnell, we never answered the question. And what made it so interesting was all of a sudden, a couple, what we'd think of as spooks, former, people that were part of the DOD. One of them in particular, a guy named Ezra Cohen jumped in. And he's a former National Security Council staffer, former part of DOD. He's got, long resume. I think probably fundamentally a good guy, actually. He was part of helping out Devin Nunes get information out back in 2017. But anyway, he jumps into the fray and starts defending Grinnell. And that's when I stepped into it and we started asking him about the State Department memo. And the premise was simple. We weren't trying to be too catchy. Just simply, hey, if the State Department had this information, how could you have issued this statement? Because surely you had the same information. And the pushback was intense and it was surprising. And essentially the argument was really basic, that you can't prove that's a real memo. It was just some rando in the State Department office that wrote it, and it was nothing. Like, why would we possibly treat that as official intelligence? Which, first of all, it was real intelligence. It was a formal assessment done by the State Department. But let's even pretend it wasn't. Let's even pretend that it was just written by some mid-level staffer there. They wrote it, it's 5 pages long. They wrote it based on a lot of information, all of which is proven to be 100% correct. It goes back to that same premise. If the State Department had that information at that time to create that, so did the intelligence community. And that argument that I was trying to make got pushed back. Yeah, it's a long thread of going back and forth. And it was, the more it went on, the more alarmed I got. And then you and I talked about this. And that's when we kind of decided, hey, we need to go back and take a harder look at this because something's going on. And even more information has now come to light.
The point that really ought to be highlighted here is that, as you said, the State Department was 100% right. So the information was there. Now, in a best case scenario, that means the entire intelligence community is completely incompetent because they couldn't find that information for themselves. That's really the best case scenario.
Right, exactly.
It was just some guy who wrote it. But of course, that scenario doesn't work either, because if that were the case, then they would have written in their statement that the source of COVID is undetermined because they're incompetent, they can't find the information. But they didn't write that. They emphatically wrote that this is not engineered, not manipulated. And then, as you said, they used that wide consensus among scientists, which is simply demonstrably not true. You just can't say that. So that's political language. And that was a political statement. And then, as you say, once you start digging further, you look at the press conference footage from back then, from April of 2020, you start piecing these bits and pieces together. You get a very, very shocking and, pretty bad story coming out of this.
A disturbing picture. It's unsettling to me.
They were undermining Trump. And so it wasn't only about undermining about the lab leak. It was also about Trump.
Yeah. So maybe now it's worth laying out a quick timeline before we add in the new. I think it might be worth holding off the information for the moment that we have from Ebright. Maybe come back to that.
Sure.
But the timeline that is laid out, obviously COVID, became widely known. It started to become known in January. But all of this can be distilled down into kind of a 1 month time frame, basically April. So sometime in April, the State Department comes out, writes this formal assessment. It's not a random email. It's not. You can find it. And writes their own assessment of it. Now, the IC doesn't do anything at the time because it's an internal assessment. It's not going out to the public. Somebody leaks it to Bill Gertz. He writes about it. The IC comes out with their assessment. Okay. Now, step back to the middle of that month. April 16th, President Trump, during a press conference, is asked if he believed that COVID came from a lab. And although he's not 100% direct with his answer, he very strongly infers that he believes COVID was leaked from a lab. What happens the very next day? There's another press conference, and at this press conference, Fauci is present. And Hans, because you originally found this, I'm going to let you step in here. Why don't you tell us what Fauci did on the 17th?
It was just incredible. He stepped up to the podium. Trump is right next to him, White House podium, White House press room, and he just lies in an incredible way. Just shows you what an absolute sociopath that guy is to be able to pull that off in front of millions of viewers. But I think more importantly, with the president standing right next to you and obviously completely contradicting him on the point that he had just made the day earlier. And what Fauci basically said is that a group of virologists have looked at this in great detail and they've determined that this is natural. And then he talks about some absolute trash, which is completely untrue, about how the sequence has evolved over time in bats and it arrived where we are. Well, that's the whole point, that it hasn't. No one's ever found an animal with that virus where you can trace it back to, it sequentially developed in some way. So it was just a total lie. But I think the cherry on top, which is the one, I guess I found that, or I was the first to really push that point when I found it. And that's maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever. So it's been around for a while, but it never ceases to amaze. It's that Fauci then says, I don't know who these people are, the virologists.
Yeah. So, I mean, the day before, Trump intimates.
He commissioned the paper. He was in touch with these guys every day. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. And to do all that while standing next to President Trump. And so you're right, this is April 16th. It's an important kind of point in that timeline that leads up to the statement by the intelligence community.
Yeah. So I believe it's April 16th that Trump intimates that it's a lab leak and that he's seen evidence that it's a lab leak, a leak from a lab. The very next day, that joint press conference, and at the end of it, Fauci kind of jumps into the fray, sort of takes over the microphone. And what does he do? He says it's a natural origin, and there's a great paper you can read that explains why it's a natural origin. That paper is Proximal Origin, which we now know, as you said, Fauci not only directed them to write, but then he edited it. He, through multiple drafts. And it's a total fiction. And again, these are the guys, Christian Anderson, Robert Gary, etc. And he pretends that he has no idea who they are on national TV. It's some off to the side, objective scientific paper that everybody should go read that proves it's a natural origin. So that's the hook where they're setting the natural origin narrative. Now, it seems like Trump probably doesn't, first of all, you've seen the pictures where Trump is sort of looming over Fauci's, shoulder and looking down at him. To my eyes, it looks like he's sort of like, what the hell is going on here? But what we know what happened was I believe it was on the 27th. It might have actually, it was April 26th. President Trump abruptly cut all funding to EcoHealth, kind of out of nowhere, severed all of their NIH funding. So obviously, he still thinks there's a problem. Now, Fauci turns around and undercuts this. He waits a few months to do it. But in August of 2020, Fauci actually gives EcoHealth a new $7.9 million grant, refunds them after Trump had terminated their funding. So then we step forward to this sudden, this request that comes out on the 29th, the day after Bill Gertz's exposure of the state memo, to have the IC come in with their assessment. That assessment is then delivered on the 30th, made public on the 1st. And what's important about this that continues to really bother us is that it seems that Trump had no idea that this intelligence community assessment was coming. Now, why do we say that? Because we have a press conference where he's asked about it in real time, and he has no idea what's going on. And the reason he was asked about it is because he claimed that he'd seen evidence personally that the virus had come from a lab. And the response was, that's really strange you would say that, because your own director of national intelligence and the backing of all of the intelligence community says exactly the opposite. And here's their statement, which we got. And Trump, you can see, there's videos out there where Trump is obviously surprised and taken off guard. Trump apparently, as far as we can tell from these clips of those press conferences, Trump had no idea that this assessment from the intelligence community was coming out, let alone that the assessment was going to be saying the opposite of what he was saying. And what happened? It invalidated everything that he was saying. The whole idea that Trump was promoting a leak from a lab became a laughingstock. Your own DNI is correcting you in real time.
Yeah, exactly. And then the media joined the pylon, of course, really focusing on this idea that Trump had made this up. He defunded EcoHealth, and his own DNI kind of dismissed the whole thing. And this is
not only dismissed, countered, right?
Countered, right? Exactly, contradicted. And then one of the headlines, we can just put it up here, is where CBS is claiming, Scott Pelley no less, is claiming that by defunding EcoHealth, Trump is sabotaging the cure. This is a completely upside down world where the guys who seeded the pandemic are suddenly supposed to be the ones who find the cure. And somehow not funding the seeding of the pandemic is going to find, it's just madness. It's total madness. But of course, this pylon was invited and the DNI gave the media what they needed. That sentence, not manipulated, not engineered, wide consensus. Boom.
At exactly the right time.
There's nothing at that point, you're done. You can't do anything if you're Trump. You can't do anything if you're just like some random guy on Twitter. You can't even do anything if you're Yuri Dagan or Rosanna Segredo, the scientists who debunked the entire natural origin narrative in real time. Again, and we're talking February of 2020. They eventually published a paper on all these findings. Remember, Rosanna had just done commentary online, and Yuri had posted online as well, but they hadn't done it in sort of a formal paper.
Yeah.
Eventually, they managed to get the formal paper out, but that was like a year later because there was like the doors were closed. There's another guy in Scotland called Dalgleish who wrote a fantastic paper exactly on that same issue, coming at it from a slightly different angle in terms of this thing being so incredibly virulent, and that just doesn't happen it just doesn't jump from nature to humans like that. And the thing has more affinity to human cells than bat cells, and it's supposed to have come from bats. I mean, it just doesn't work that way. So Dalgleish wrote about that shortly after this whole IC thing. I think it was in June, July, and no one would touch his paper. He just couldn't get it out. And then so same for Rosanna and Yuri, and everyone was just was basically shut off from saying anything. And then in 2021, we had our friend Roland Wiesendanger come along. This is a Swiss professor at the University of Hamburg, and he wrote this fantastic 100+ page paper that not only looked at the evidence in terms of the virus, the genomic sequence of the virus and the furin cleavage site and all that, but that too, but at everything. The missing scientists, the state of the lab, the poor maintenance of the lab, the biosafety level 2 issue, all of that, pages and pages and pages worth of stuff. And he was just, his information was suppressed. No one would report about it. I mean, they really did a fantastic job. It wasn't until Nicholas Wade came along that we were even allowed to talk about it.
Yep. And, so effectively, this IC assessment that was wrong on every front was incorrect, both in terms of not being a scientific consensus and in terms of their conclusions, not genetically modified, not man-made, basically established the natural origin narrative, and it kept it kept it going for well over a year. And as you said, nobody was able to respond to it because the intelligence community in its entirety, the Director of National Intelligence, they all agree. And it was all fiction. Now, we're going to make this whole situation a little worse with some new information that we got yesterday. And, this is the beauty of X, of Twitter, of being able to interact. You and I have come to know reasonably well, or at least interact with a number of virologists as part of our, looking into COVID for forever. And when I was sending out these threads on this information, just what we've been talking about, Richard Ebright jumped in. And for those who don't know, Richard Ebright's a pretty famous virologist, and he's kind of a crusty, no holds, just I'm straightforward kind of guy. And what he divulged floored the both of us. He responded to the tweets that I was sending out, and the information that he gave us is this. It's twofold. First of all, the FBI was told in early January by a reliable whistleblower that COVID had leaked from a lab, a highly reliable whistleblower. So much so that their entire squad of FBI squad dedicated to China had actually met with this person. It appears they were 100% convinced this was not some random person. As a matter of fact, it's starting to feel like it might have even been somebody from within the lab. But the wording around it was highly credible. So they knew this in early January 2020. In other words, right away. Here's the other piece of information that was shocking. Not only did they know this information, but they set up a task force. And that task force was established sometime in late March 2020. And we know that there was a task force because they interviewed Richard Ebright. And what were they doing when they were interviewing Richard Ebright? They were presenting him with EcoHealth's paper on the whole matter. They were looking at EcoHealth as being the source of the outbreak, of the COVID outbreak, and they were looking specifically at EcoHealth's paper that we now know was probably the proposal that created COVID. And they were bringing in Ebright to help him sort of decipher the technical language within that report. So EcoHealth was quite literally, according to Ebright, was the source of their investigation, the source of their task force. And what happened from there? Ebright was interviewed twice, once in April and once in early May. Shortly after Ebright was interviewed the second time, that task force was summarily disbanded. Now, we asked Ebright, did he know who disbanded it? Was it FBI leadership? Was it somebody higher up in the echelon of the broader intelligence community? He doesn't know the answer to that. But, all of this is kind of blockbuster stuff if you think about it, that you've got the intelligence community putting out a fabricated assessment. Meanwhile, the FBI has a witness, and they have a task force, and they're looking directly at EcoHealth as being responsible for this, all in April of 2020.
And so this brings us to the point of, we really listed a number of things that fraudulent national intelligence statement, Director of National Intelligence statement, achieved. And we can add the FBI now to the statement, shutting down the FBI investigation. Now, I don't know enough about the inner workings of these kinds of that particular task force or in general to know how that would happen. Why would that task force not be able to push back? Why would they say, no, they got it wrong, or this is political, or whatever? We know the truth. Why was it disbanded anyway? I don't know enough to say. I think no one knows. I mean, but that's something really that we ought to find out, because someone disbanded that. Was Christopher Wray involved? Now he seems to be all lab leak. What was going on back then? Were people blackmailed? I mean, we just simply don't know. But it's extremely troubling that one statement from the DNI can shut down an entire investigation. And obviously, as you say, an investigation that started with a whistleblower at exactly the time when, before it even arrived, January of 2020, that whistleblower having told many other things that checked out, not to do with COVID. I mean, just an informant who yeah. I assume some kind of Chinese government official. And that's how you measure it. Did what this guy say check out or not, right? And then the fact that it was shut down. It's just, and by the way, they were on the right path. I mean, the EcoHealth grant proposals were exact, and having Ebright explain those is exactly right. That's exactly what you do, because this talks about consensus viruses, which is what COVID is. It's not a previous virus. A consensus virus is one you kind of piece together from other bits and pieces. And making it more virulent in humans. And in fact, one of the proposals made it 10,000 times more virulent. The stuff is all there. So they were absolutely on the right path, and then they were shut down. And that needs to be investigated. And it's just so frustrating seeing GOP. We still haven't seen the Daszak interview. They interviewed Daszak in November. I haven't seen it. They interviewed Fauci at the beginning of January. We haven't seen it. In the meantime, they released from last week, Hunter's art dealer. But that script we can see, but we can't see this other stuff. That needs to be investigated. What exactly happened to shut down the FBI investigation? And more generally, what exactly happened in terms of that particular, the point that Techno made? Who wanted this statement written?
Who wanted the statement
the blacked out name
created? Yep. Now, under normal circumstances, the answer to who shut this down would probably be limited to two parties. And one would be the leadership of the FBI, and secondarily, the leadership of the DOJ, because ultimately the FBI reports to the DOJ. It's a subset thereof. However, in this politically charged environment, I would argue, and I'm guessing you would too, that all bets are kind of off, that the normal lines of authority could be blurred. So you couldn't say with any authority that it was either FBI leadership or DOJ. Now this issue seemed to surmount that. It could, who knows where it came from? We don't know the answer to that question. But it is notable that the FBI, to their credit, and I hate to give credit to the FBI as much as I despise them, but they did sort of stick to their guns. So, now bear in mind this whole discussion about the IC assessment and how it was done based on early information, how bad that was. Well, to make matters even worse, there was a more formal assessment that came out more than a year later, August 2021. It was the formal intelligence community assessment, and 4 out of the 5 intelligence agencies plus an entity that I wasn't even really that familiar with, the National Intelligence Community Council, some sort of council of this that's separate from the DNI. So the 4 major agencies, the 4 major groupings plus this council all agreed that it was a natural origin in August 2021. The only one that dissented from that was the FBI. So,
and we have the information that the CIA was paid off. Well,
Yeah, that's a great point. Exactly.
Analysts were paid off. So that, of course, leaves, you mentioned AG Barr or Ray, head of FBI. By the way, Barr, as much as people say about him this or that, and we can have a whole show on that guy, he is not a natural origin narrative guy. He's never been that. He hasn't pushed lab leak either, but I just don't see that, because he just hasn't appeared in that discussion. What it could also be is it could be from the other way around, from the bottom, not from the top. By which I mean, you go and just bribe the people on a task force. Just find 4 or 5 people who have problems, and you threaten them, or you bribe them with money, or exactly what's been reported happened at the CIA, where they got 6 of the analysts to flip from lab leak to natural origin to make all these problems go away. Maybe that happened on the task force. Suddenly, let's say the task force is 5 people or 9 people or 10 people, whatever, and you have half of them flip because of something that happened in the background. Well, then the problem is gone, because then if your own task force is not with you, then doesn't matter what Ebright says, doesn't matter what the whistleblower says.
Yeah, on the CIA issue, I mean, that's pretty notable, because I was just looking for the numbers here, but I think it was 6 of 7 analysts said that it was a lab leak. So it wasn't like it was one analyst saying, like in a jury where you got one holdout and the rest of the jury is trying to convince that one guy. This is the preponderance of analysts are saying that it's a lab origin, and they were all financially incentivized to change their opinion, and it was done by one of the most senior people within the CIA. So
exactly,
we've got this. It's all incredibly disturbing.
It truly is, and given all the bad stuff the IC has done, I mean, Russiagate is obviously the big one. But we can go further back. We can look at Iraq War, right? WMD, all of that. Just make stuff up. This is just another one in a long chain of things. The problem being that it has never been in any way investigated. Before we can even get to investigation of that, we still have to cross the boundary where people start realizing this came out of a lab. I think we're edging to, we talked about this on previous shows, we're edging towards sort of a critical mass there, where you have enough people, normies, just random people out in the streets who understand, okay, it did come out of a lab. By the way, there's no evidence for natural origin. That's been a lie. And it took me a long while to realize that people don't know that they don't realize that a lot of people, I was speaking to a good friend the other day who is lab leak, doesn't follow this stuff like you and I, but who genuinely thought, who doesn't cover it in the same way we do, but who genuinely thought, there's some evidence on both sides, but probably more lab leak. And then it dawned on me that people actually think that there is evidence for natural origin, which there isn't. It's just zero. It doesn't exist, right?
Yeah, that's a really important point to make, is that there is no evidence of a natural origin. It's numerically, it's a matter of numerical possibility. But there hasn't, it gets portrayed as if there's sort of this, first of all, a preponderance of natural origin evidence, and now it's sort of like, well, there's evidence on both sides. No, that's not true at all. There's a ton of evidence for a lab leak, and it's growing by the day, and there's a numerical possibility that statistically it could have happened from natural origin, but that's it. And that number is getting smaller and smaller.
Because there is not one piece of evidence.
No.
It just doesn't exist. Not one. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that point, I think, needs to really be pushed across much stronger. But as I said, I think we're inching our way towards there. So once, you cross that boundary and people go, oh, okay, once it's kind of widely accepted that this did come out of a lab, then just like once it, was widely accepted that there were no WMD, then you can maybe get to the point where you have a discussion about, well, let's investigate what happened here. And I'm very pessimistic about that happening. I just don't think it will, because they'll just all circle the wagons. By they, DC, bureaucracy, IC, media, all of them. But that's what needs to happen. Otherwise, these things will just keep happening over and over, because again, we're not just talking about protecting Fauci or individuals or whatever. We're talking about lying to the President of the United States, because as you mentioned, this was released while Trump was in a live press conference, and he was just completely blindsided. He had no idea. He was like, what statement? Who issued the statement? It's right there on tape. He has no idea what's going on.
Right. Now, as we kind of close this out, for me, that leaves, I guess, a couple big questions and maybe one conclusion of those sorts. And the questions are, I mean, I think we've got some real questions that need to get answered by Grinnell in regards to the issuance of that statement. You know, there's a lot of questions there. Obviously, if you paid attention to this, you probably have the same questions. There's also questions that probably need to be answered by the follow-on. Grinnell was acting director of national intelligence. He was the guy that was in place when the statement was issued, but shortly thereafter, John Ratcliffe came in, and Ratcliffe became the actual DNI, not acting, and held that position for the rest of time. And, you know, I feel like both of those guys, that there's a responsibility to respond to all of this information. If I don't fully understand how they can place it in a good light in the context of things, because these are just facts. These things happened, but maybe they can, but I think they need to do so. The other thing that I think is worth going out on is I feel like personally, and you can respond here and tell me if you think differently, but I feel like we're starting to see a reason why the intelligence community acted the way that it did. And that is the more evidence that's come out. We've had a flood of it in the last 2 weeks. You know, where we've got a number of, the virologists that we interact with are saying, it's game over, it's done. It was a lab leak, it's definitive in their minds. I don't want to speak for all of them, but I mean, it's that kind of positioning. Well, maybe that answers the questions behind the IC's actions, because what were they doing with their actions? They're effectively protecting the fact that it was researchers in the United States that effectively created the virus that then spread across the world. Now, the virus came out of the lab in Wuhan, but the blueprint for it and the creation of it was actually done in part by U.S. researchers, that then that work was carried out by Chinese individuals at the Wuhan lab. And I wonder if that's not the reason for, the way they acted, the way that they did.
Yeah, and Western, the blueprint, as well as the Western advanced Western biotechnology.
Yes.
The humanized mice. Ralph Barrick gave the Wuhan lab these humanized mice, without which none of this would have happened.
Yep.
Now, strictly legally, I think it's still the Wuhan lab's fault and the Chinese government's fault, because it's their lab. And that's where these things went on.
Yeah, you mean in terms of the fundamental aspect of a leak itself? That was the lab at which it leaked.
If this was a court case, if you brought China to like some international tribunal, if you just played this out, let's say, there's a bunch of hurdles. We can have a show on that sometime. There's a bunch of hurdles you have to go through. The lab, it needs to have some non-state function, which the lab did, because they were doing vaccines and that was for profit. Okay, as soon as you have that, then you can go against the country as a whole for compensation. And this has happened many times in incidents where countries have been sued by other countries for compensation for this and that, disasters and accidents and spillages and whatever. So there's a lot of precedent for that. So you do that, and it's possible. And just if you just wear a legal hat here, it's the Wuhan lab. I mean, it doesn't matter where they got the instruction manual from, doesn't matter where they got the technology from. If they did the work, they're responsible. But that doesn't kind of absolve Fauci and Barrick and all those people, because what on earth were they doing, giving a hostile regime all that technology? I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah, there was something, I was trying to find it here, and unfortunately I don't think I can, but there was also something that Ebright said when he let us know about the fact that, the whistleblower in January, and the fact that there was an FBI task force. And he said something to the effect that he had talked to a very well-placed, unknown, he wasn't going to divulge her identity, but a very well-placed individual who told him just the day before yesterday that all of this has been designed to protect Fauci, and that that's still being carried out to this day.
And on that point, he was the one appointed by Dick Cheney after 9/11 as the country's biodefense/bioweapons. By the way, biodefense and bioweapons is exactly the same thing. It's just two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly. It's two sides to the same coin.
And he was appointed as the country's biodefense coordinator, or whatever. You can look up his title, but that was Fauci. So that goes back all the way there in terms of why he needs to be protected. And anyway, to me, I don't care about any of those things. He needs to be held accountable.
I agree completely.